And so here, if you have not met Javier, Javier is our newish curator at the Silver City Museum, and he has been tasked with doing something that he tells me he loves, and that is being able to research into communities and uncover information and hear people's stories. And so since we began the Chihuahua Hill project, he has been going out and interviewing people who have a connection with Chihuahua Hill, and a lot has been uncovered. And one of the themes he uncovered is a mention of poverty. And it's not fun to talk about, but it's true and it's real. And people have lived with it, and it divides us sometimes. Anyway, I am very, very excited to be able to introduce Javier Marrufo.
Hi. Thank you, Erin, for summarizing my first two slides. Okay, so yeah, for this presentation, I just wanted to kind of explore what I've been calling economic segregation here in Grant County. You know, the museum for this quarter has been focusing on the economy, and we were kind of coming up with ideas one day, and this idea of economic segregation came out of a couple different things. One I'm going to bring up right now, and then another I want to bring up at the end, and maybe that'll help propel us into the conversation part of this. So could you change the slide, please? So yeah, this was kind of born out of the Chihuahua Hill project. I'm sure all of you have heard about it in some capacity by now, but the most basic version is it's a history project surrounding the historically Hispanic neighborhood of Chihuahua Hill here in Silver City. And, you know, while conducting this research with people who've had, you know, a lifelong connection here, a lot of things have been popping up, you know, a lot of different things kind of weave their way through all the stories. But yeah, poverty is one in particular that I wanted to focus on. So could you start the next slide, please? I threw together this little thing.
My mother and my dad, yes, we were just poor. But they knew that, yes, but they were just easy. They knew the money people. They were all people.
Little on the nose, huh? So yeah, I just wanted to give everybody a sense of how it's been, you know, the work that I've been doing. I hear this from most every single person that I talk to. You know, I think I would say 90% of the people that I've interviewed has said we were poor in some way or another. Can you change the slide? So poverty has been one of the main themes overarching in the historical content coming out of the Chihuahua Hill History Project. It's not too surprising, especially being from here. But there was an aspect of something that people were saying, that they were saying it almost as much as the poverty itself. And one of those people in there actually talked about it. She talked about how she didn't really realize she was poor until there was outside context. So I threw together another little clip, kind of going more into detail about that. So yeah, I kind of started thinking the story isn't only that these people were poor, but they were poor in relation to others. You know, and something that I felt, you know, growing up here, definitely. I just said it on the radio the other day. When I was growing up, I wouldn't say I was poor, but once I got to middle school, all of a sudden it seemed like a bunch of people were richer than me. You know, so from what I've been learning from the Chihuahua Hill History Project, it kind of seems that the poverty, at least amongst the people I've talked to, fell along ethnic and racial lines. So the story wasn't simply that Mexicans were poor. The story was that Mexicans were poor and white people had money. You know, I wanted to look into why that is. Could you go to the next slide, please? So my research was pretty simple. I wanted to know, you know, why that came to be. When did it start? Was it specific only to here, or was it a perversive problem? And how it was done, you know, how it continues and stuff like that. So if you could switch to the next slide. So thinking about local, I was kind of thinking about the beginnings of Silver City. I'm lucky in my office that I have this huge bookcase and it's filled with binders of pictures. It's like the entire photo collection from the museum. Look at them all the time. And I see pictures like this. So this is Silver City in the 1880s. Over on the left, the big building, that's the public school building. The building in the middle, that's, what's that? St. Vincent's, back when it only had one tower. The building on the right, that's the old courthouse. You could switch to the next slide. Here's a continuation of that same picture. You can see Broadway Street. Pretty nice street for back then. You can see the house that would become the museum and its twin right next to it. All the trees, nice fences. Looks like a pretty good place to live. Can you go to the next slide? So here's Broadway from the opposite side. You can see, you know, all the buildings are made of brick. There's beautiful facades on some of those buildings downtown that are still there today. Could you go to the next slide? And in contrast, this is Chihuahua Hill at the same time. You know, Chihuahua Hill in a lot of sources back then was called the Mexican quarter of town. And just look at the difference in the homes. They're all adobe brick or rock. Some of the roofs in the back are thatched. There's one nice looking house. I kind of wonder about that person. I think it's important to remind ourselves that at this time, there was no official policy of segregation in Silver City. But by looking at the pictures, it's clearly, it's so clear that there's a massive disconnect. And it's a problem that's been around since the early days of the town. So I think it's economic segregation. The division of people created not by official policy, but by economic circumstance. It manifests in a couple different ways, and we're going to explore those today. But thinking about the early days of the town, I went over to the 1880 census to get more of a look about what was going on here. Could you go to the next slide? The 1880 census. It's a great resource. It's the first year that Silver City appears on the census. So it's an amazing primary source, from the time, just a decade after the town was founded. Could you go to the next slide? I added a picture of it just because I've been spending so much time with it. I thought maybe some of you might want to see what it looks like. Not really important at all. I love that. I love that where it says state of New Mexico, they just crossed out state and wrote territory. People haven't changed. Okay, so go to the next slide, please. So these are, for the most part, the occupations that I found on the 1880 census. This isn't 100% complete list. I did combine some things that were kind of redundant. But I would say these 80 jobs represent a 95% accurate list of everything that was here in the town. So it ranges from adobe masons to sawmill man, office clerks, lawyers, bullwhacker, my personal favorite, or gambler. There was like 8 people in town who listed their occupation as gambler back then. Pretty cool. Yeah. But as you can see, there was a nice mix of available occupations here in the town. Since I was thinking about, the division in economic segregation, I wanted to break this down by ethnic lines. So could you please go to the next slide? So these were the occupations held by white workers. There was 3 where they weren't present: adobe makers, janitors, and silversmiths. There's 1 silversmith in town, according to the census, and he was Mexicano. Pretty cool. So out of the 80 jobs available here, they were in 77. This, by contrast, is the occupations held by Mexican workers. You can see it's a lot less. Of the nearly 80 kinds of jobs available, Mexican workers only work 27 of them. And we see that it's a far more limited mix of jobs, mostly labor and service positions. Although there was still the silversmith and a photographer. I want to see that guy's pictures. I hope I find him one day. You can tell that, between the Mexican and white workers, there were far less employment opportunities for the Mexicans. And even more concerning than this was the Black and Chinese citizens here in town. They had 8 jobs that they worked. Day laborer, cook, restaurateur, servant, washer, waiter, store clerk. So I think this is a pretty clear demonstration. Could you go to the next slide? This is a pretty clear demonstration about how financial opportunity fell among ethnic lines. Only certain groups were allowed to work certain jobs. And then that meant that certain groups made less money than others. Certain parts of town became the poor parts of town. The opportunities were far more limited. And, chances for improvement or advancement, economically or socially, were just ridiculously slim. I can't tell you how bad of a feeling it is to be going through hundreds of lines of a census, and every time you see the word servant, you just know in your head that it's going to be a Mexican. Not fun. But yeah, you see a clear pattern. I also wanted to look at some of the groups that were, or some of the occupations that were held by every group in town. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So day laborer, that was a very common job back then, and all ethnic groups in the town held it. But with the breakdown, you can see that it was a very unequal breakdown. Of the people listed as day laborers, 56 were Mexican, 11 were white, and 2 were Black and Chinese. The Black and Chinese, I think they were smaller populations, so they're just not as present in the census at the time. For servants, even bigger gap, 43 were Mexican, 5 were white, 2 were Black and Chinese. Mexicans seem to dominate the local freighting industry, at least until the railroad came around. I'm not sure about afterward. And at the bottom here, we have positions that were only held by white workers in the town. So engineers and machinists, there was 22 of them, all white. Physicians and scientists, 17, all white. And law enforcement, the 3 law enforcement people, all white. So, it goes to show how some of this was happening. Certain groups in town had the jobs that paid more, certain groups had the jobs that paid less. Income is an important marker in our society. Economic position, it informs others, the way that they think about us, or even the way that we think about ourselves. It's one of the factors that ultimately decides our place in society. It dictates in some way who we are and what we can be in the future. And income, it helps illustrate the gaps in between us socially. So yeah, early Silver City, it was a situation of extreme economic inequality. And it's extremely damaging, and it has long-term impacts for the communities who continue to be here. Could you change the slide, please? So this information tells us that no, while there wasn't any official policy of segregation in the town was still segregated in some way. I mean, it's obvious looking at the difference between Chihuahua Hill and the rest of Silver City. And the fact that, Chihuahua Hill was the Mexican part of town. Economic segregation relegated certain ethnic groups to lowest paying jobs and unofficially segregated the community. Groups employed in these jobs, they had little, if any, room for advancement. They usually fulfilled the role of cheap labor. And while the professional work or skilled labor was almost entirely comprised of Anglo workers. So I think this kind of helps illustrate the difference between, could you use the picture? Living this kind of life. This is from the same photo series. So around 1880. And could you go to the next? And this kind of life. I think those 2 pictures perfectly illustrate it. Even though there wasn't any official segregation, this is what was going on. So I think that kind of talks about how things were happening, but it doesn't necessarily tell us about how it started. And for that, I think we need to take a look at the bigger picture. So 19th century America. I always think about the annexation of northern Mexico and then the subsequent territorial period. Could you change the slide, please? I think a lot of people underestimate the longevity of the impacts that the Mexican-American War had in the region. I always try to put it in perspective. Control of this region changed between the Spanish to the Mexicans to the Americans in 3 decades. Could you imagine in 30 years of your life going from one government to another that's completely different? I always think it must have been a very confusing time to live in. the last change between Mexico and the United States, it completely reorganized the power structure, the political structure, the economic structure throughout the entire American Southwest. They introduced new American ideologies surrounding race and nationality and culture to a region that was, for the most part, Hispanic. There's a lot more mixing going on. And the whole era was in some part built on the concept of American paternalism, the kind of idea that America's new authority over northern Mexico was for the benefit of the citizens who lived here. Instead of benefiting from it, Mexicans who became Mexican Americans, across the board, they just became subject to widespread loss of land, loss of social status. Even in some terms, loss of personal agency. And, they had a law imposed on them that was written in another language by citizens of a region who didn't have anything to do with them. Yeah, this is a super complex topic, so I don't really want to spend a lot of time here, but I always say that this is the start of, could you change this slide, please? Of the way things always were. That's the way I like to put it. I think it's a little bit more palatable for some people than institutionalized racism. I don't know if any of you know this picture or have ever seen it. These are artifacts that were pulled out of the mine here in Santa Rita from the old Spanish mines. You can see the ladder made out of a log with little footholds cut into it, and then some bags and stuff. I think it's a fitting picture because I think the place here in Grant County that describes the way things always were the best is the community of Santa Rita, New Mexico. Could you change the slide? Santa Rita, New Mexico, birthplace of Jesus Arellano, my grandpa. So Santa Rita is the place where you see a lot of the aspects of economic segregation that we've been talking to pushed to their absolute extremes. So I made some graphs for you. If you could go to the next slide. So I did kind of the same work that I did with the 1880 census, but for Santa Rita in 1900, just the turn of the century. I only looked at general laborers right here. And you can see how big the divide was. Out of the 159 people listed as general laborers in Santa Rita in the turn of the century, 138 were Mexican. Only 21 were white. And if you go forward in time, it gets even worse. Could you change the slide? So once again, we see that margin widened. Very similar trend from what we saw in Silver City, what we saw 20 years earlier in Santa Rita. Out of the 425 general laborers listed there, 420 were Mexican. Only 5 were white. And it's 90 some percent. It's really crazy. Could you change the slide? And once again, we see a similar trend in skill positions. Out of the office employees, 5 were Mexican and 8 were white. Out of the total 28 white, out of the total 28 foremen, 31 foremen, 28 were white, and only 3 were Mexican. One of them was my great-great-grandpa. Foreman on the tracks. And once again, there was a total of 13 engineers, scientists, and doctors. All were white. I liked the graphs because it kind of showed how big the gaps are. I made a couple more, if you could go to the next slide. So this is how it breaks down. Of all the Mexican workers working at the mine there, a total of 484. 442 were general laborers. So 91% of the Mexicans working in the copper mine were unskilled laborers. Only 9 were in skilled positions in management. And of those 9%, they were probably making less money than their white counterparts. And almost in complete contrast, could you go to the next slide? Were the white workers in the mine. Out of the total 335 white workers, only 34 of them were in unskilled labor jobs. So 10% were unskilled, while the remaining 90% worked skilled labor and management positions. It's crazy. And it's so blatant. And, you know, there is just not a lot that people could do for a long time. Could you change the slide? So I always say that Santa Rita was kind of a masterclass in economic segregation. Most workers were denied the opportunity to work jobs above menial labor. These positions, like the powder crew or the track crews, they're usually more dangerous. They were always for less pay, and there was no opportunity for advancement in any of them. Many people worked their entire career at the mine in the same position that they started at, usually making a little bit more pay though. The dual wage system meant that Mexican workers almost always made less money than their white counterparts, even when working the same jobs. So by keeping people employed in the lowest paying positions and ensuring that their positions always remained low, it kind of bred a cycle of poverty that affects all aspects of society there. On top of this was the social reality in Santa Rita, where it was a very purposefully segregated company town. And you know, that purposeful segregation was just reinforced by the economic circumstances. You know, Mexicans lived in one place, white people lived on the other. White workers were able to rent homes from the mine, while Mexicans had lots where they had to build their own houses. And, you know, most people couldn't afford to build a house. So they were simple. I'm sure you guys have seen the pictures or heard people talk about them. They weren't much. So these circumstances that were in Santa Rita, you know, they're the kind of things that would influence the people who chose to stand up and do something about it. You know, the miners who were constantly on strike. You know, especially the famous Empire Zinc mine strike, which really acted as a catalyst for change and, you know, made it to where a lot of this stuff began to slowly get better over time. So I wanted to kind of, you know, thinking about Santa Rita, I wanted to give a perspective of somebody who was living there at the time. So I talked to somebody who was a child during all this. Yeah, so I've kind of been obsessed with showing the personal aspects of history, how all of this stuff actually affected people's lives and how it changed their experiences and what their experiences were with it. So I was kind of going back and forth between whether or not I should give more data and show more how things were bad, or just show people's experiences and let them talk for themselves. So that's really what I want to do. But one thing that she said I would ask everybody to keep in mind while we go forward in this. She talked about how there's some things that they wouldn't do just because that's not what Mexicans do. I think that's a nice little thing to keep in mind while we listen to the rest of these things. So yeah, from here on, I put together little pieces kind of showing people's experience with this kind of economic segregation, both in the mining district and here in Silver. So yeah, so this is kind of a small example, and it might seem like it doesn't mean a lot, but it definitely meant a lot to the people who lived back then. I thought it was interesting that there is this division around the swimming pools. And the pool, it definitely was open to anybody, but the sense I've gotten is, while Mexicans certainly did go there, they couldn't always afford it. So, that's already one barrier. Whenever they could afford it, it was just reinforced by that discriminatory shower policy that their white counterparts didn't have to go through. In contrast to that, having to pay money that you don't always have and then having to shower on top of it. The Bañadero, it was just a swimming hole over there in the big ditch, and it was rocky. People tell me sometimes there was dead fish. Sometimes there was oil running off from one of the car dealerships. But that's just the kind of differences that emerge, from this kind of economic segregation. But it seemed like most people didn't mind. It seemed like everybody talks about the Bañadero kind of lovingly, like everyone had a good time there. Could you go to the next slide? So yeah, I call that social exclusion because of your economic circumstance. This is somebody who participated in the Chihuahua Hill project. He took me down to where the Bañadero used to be. There's nothing there anymore. The bridge got built over it, and the water doesn't really pool there. But this kind of social exclusion due to economic circumstance, it influences divisions in people. In this part, it was recreation, but there's a ton of small things like that, and they kind of happen across the board. So let's check out another one. Yeah, so it's just all of these little small things that build on each other. Does everybody know what the Kiwanis is? Their mission is really simple, just to help kids around the world. Essentially, they're committed to creating more opportunities for children to succeed. And this is the 1960s he was talking about. So can you imagine he wasn't able to be part of an organization that, was committed to the betterment of his children because he couldn't afford it, because he was working in the mines at the time and they were, terribly segregated. And he just wasn't making enough money to do, anything about it. It got me thinking about inequality of resources that comes with, this division in this economic division. So thinking about that, let's continue to the next one. And one more. Forward.
No. No. When I know that my grandpa only went to school to the first grade. I know that my grandma, who was born in Mexico, left Mexico, and so my grandma went to figure education. Grandma, he got both schools. He speaks English and Spanish, however, my grandpa didn't know how to read. He didn't know how to read strategy, so. But my grandma told me that before we had this, of course, the reason they only person for daily people was not made. So I remember she said that she worked for Patsy, and she was kept, she worked at the holy where she earned a lot of money, just hanging over. And because she had a health problem, she was stayed on the porch and when we got cold, I went to work finish every day up there. So that's really we talked about it was snowing, it was really good. But she slept in the porch and we slept had a screen porch. But downstairs there's an inches of that snow. Pushing. Se acabó el trabajo de la farm. Ahora la justicia. Entonces, no se quiere trabajar forever, it's too much money. Y tal vez la vivienda de Pentecost en la mina, en Fire Street, the dream of the knows about. A great way, so very respectful. And I guess I was thought. And that's just what before. And how. I liked it. I went into hardwood. We're lucky today. We are lucky. We're what we had at the time. If they call hard work now, I don't call it hard work.
You could go to the next slide. Yeah, so all of these, I think they show another aspect of what I'm trying to talk about. You know, either people couldn't afford to get into schools that were arguably better, or they just didn't have a chance to get an education at all because they had to work to help support their family. And you know, this happened across the board within all ethnic groups, but I would argue that it absolutely happened more to the people who were kept you know, at the bottom rungs of the economic ladder. I also wanted to say that the second story there, the people who only had a first and third grade education, those were my great grandparents. And by all accounts, they were amazing people, and they kind of committed their entire lives to other people. You know, even though they didn't have an education, they encouraged a lot of other people to get theirs, and they worked really hard so their family members could get their own educations. But yeah, they're just thinking about that and how hard they worked and the kind of jobs that they worked. I kind of wanted to follow that thread about occupations and what was available. You know, we talked about how people, you know, were kept out of certain jobs or kept in certain positions. So could you play the next one? You can go to the next slide. Yeah, so I just always wonder, because things are definitely better than they were back then now. I wonder what it must have felt like to feel all of these different opposing things, you know, acting on your life. And I wanted to kind of think about And I think all of you should think about it too. What that does to people to be continuously forced into lower economic circumstances without many opportunities to get out of that. What does that do to people in their own lives and their children's lives and generationally? You know, there's this reinforcement of a cycle of poverty going on. And you know, I was looking into all the different ways that that reinforcement plays out, and we kind of came to the title of this whole presentation, redlining. Does everybody? I shouldn't ask. I'll just tell you guys. So redlining, it was a discriminatory practice where mortgage lenders and insurance providers would restrict services to certain areas, usually, once again, among ethnic lines. The restrictions, they got their name because on maps, they literally drew red lines around the neighborhoods that they wouldn't, you know, give services to. And that was common across America. I think most people, when they talk about redlining, they're talking about urban centers, you know, big cities with big ethnic neighborhoods, but it happened all over the place. So yeah, just thinking about this purposeful restricting of peoples into certain neighborhoods. We have the next clip. Yeah, unfortunately, he doesn't live in Silver City anymore. So he was all about this presentation. Well, I think he named the wrong place. Do you know, Susan? Where is that? Up near the high school? Okay. Okay. Well, yeah, that's the place he was talking about. Do you know when that addition got built? Okay.
Homes there.
I just want to remind you guys, if you can repeat that into the mic so the people at home can hear.
Oh, that was in the 50s. They called them the VA homes, and the GIs coming back, they would get the GI bills and they could buy these homes.
Okay.
But that was up on Swan, like they were saying, Man Royal. Yeah,
Okay.
and you can still see the homes. They all look similar to each other.
Oh, so they were VA homes. That makes it even worse if they're denying a veteran.
Wow.
When, you know, I
Thank
like
you.
this clip because it's kind of one of those things that perfectly encapsulates what I'm talking about. And it also shows both the problem and the solution. You know, he didn't accept it and he fought back and he said it took him a long time. I actually cut this clip down a lot because he went on about it. But he finally got to live there. You know, everybody going through these experiences, they were cognizant about what was going on. How couldn't they be? You know, everybody knew what was happening was wrong. It was just, what could you really do to stop it? You know, so I've talked to a lot of people and they talk about kind of confronting the way things have always been. And, you know, I think how hard it must have been after nearly, you know, a century of conditioning people to think that this is the way your life is and this is the way it's going to play out and this is why it's not going to change. So I'm always super grateful to those people who have endured stuff like this and, you know, recognize the problem and instill values, you know, like in my generation, who would drive them to overcome a lot of these things. So I was kind of thinking about, you know, people knowing and then the legacy of the whole thing. So I put together this next clip. Yeesh. It's pretty real, that. So yeah, I just, you know, I always say that I'm grateful for those people who put up with it and, you know, try to change it. And things have been changing, you know, steadily for a long time. I wouldn't say things are 100% fixed, but things are getting better constantly. I wanted to kind of talking about the legacy of all this. I think that's something we can get more into with the whole conversation part of this, because I think we're a little bit over time for this. But I wanted to wrap up with kind of a good ending, good story. And it's featuring somebody who's sitting right here. So can we play the next one?
I was about 15 and I was beautiful dressed and not that so bad. So I knew it was benefit. So I saved and saved and saved that, you know, and that area that I think I have maybe $25, $30 after a couple of months, you know. And my girlfriend, Lori, and I come in, and we walked into the door, the baby got over the top. Hurried over, and I said, you know, I want to try on that dress. And he said, how many you can? Okay, so we walked across the street, I went to Stacy and, you know, that's the dress. Anyway, in 2002, I got a baby. And I decided to made now to the bill. And before I started the bill, I had to many years ago. Now I'm not.
Isn't that awesome? Overcoming. That's what we all should strive for. You know, winning with your own success. So yeah, I want to kind of more maybe in the next part talk about the legacy of all of these things and, you know, how much remains. Can you go to the next slide? You know, I would like people to think about, you know, have these things gotten any better? Have they stayed the same? Have they gotten worse? Well, remember in the beginning, I told you I kind of had two inspirations for this project. The second one I wanted to save for the end, so maybe we could bring it up, you know, in the community conversation part. So, you know, just thinking about all the things that we've already talked about today and the circumstances behind everything. I'll show you this last clip and then we'll be done. I went over to El Grito Head Start and I interviewed them for the Chihuahua Hill project. This clip specifically is me and the person I was working with asking about the economic qualifications to get into the program.
Now it's a perfect place to be 30 years later. This is a lower than me. Well, I have a little chart that I go by. Before family is born, it's 26,000. So, you know, I can tell you that when I started in this position, as far as picking up and creating the children. I think we have many instruments. Now, I can say we have probably maybe 94. And
Yeah, so that was in 2021, so very recently. So yeah, that was one of the inspirations for this project for me. To me, that signified something. There's still some sort of divide going on. So just think about that. And I think we'll have our intermission and then we'll come back with our panelists. So thank you everyone for listening. I hope.
This is my sanitizer.
I have heard a number of stories that the bars in Grant County were also segregated. And I wonder if any of you have heard about that.
I believe that there was a bar called the Dick's Club where the Moose Club is right now. And boy, you couldn't go in there. Barker's, which was downtown, also served alcohol. And yeah, Mexican people didn't go there. They went to the Buffalo Bar owned by Joe Acosta back in my day. And I think the Murray, I'm thinking the bar at the Murray also was off limits to Hispanics.
Okay, and we have a question from at home. Was there ever any attempts to organize and protest in some fashion, or just a group of people trying to make their plights better known? Well, there's a lot of incidents of that. Well, one very famous one, the Empire Zinc strike, if you would like to expand, Javi.
Yeah, the most famous one is probably what Grant County is most known for, is the Empire Zinc mine strike. In 1952, the men went on strike to protest the conditions there at the mine. Okay.
Okay, Steve Fox has something to contribute to that. Steve is one of our scholars that contributes frequently.
Hi, Steve.
Great job, Javi. I thought using the voices, hearing the voices was so effective. It made it more human. Like these are real people. We've heard these stories, but now we're hearing them talk about it. On the issue of were there protests, I would mention two from the 70s and the 80s. The Brown Berets paid their famous visit to Grant County in the fall of 1971, stirring things up. And what's interesting is there was a real generational difference. People under 30, like you, Patsy, welcome them here, let them use the facilities at the Chicano Center on Chihuahua Hill, for example. People over 30, didn't matter, Anglo or Hispanic, none of the people over 30 approved of the Brown Berets. They were this radical group modeled on the Black Panthers. The second one was El Reportero newspaper in the 1980s, published by Greg Mesa, edited by Luis Quinones. That was the real high point of Hispanic protest in this county in that time.
Awesome.
The Brown Berets, when they came down, we at that time had what we called the Chicano Youth Center right across from the Lincoln School. And they came in from California, and it was a group of young men. At that time, Vista was here, and we had 4 Vista workers, and we had a committee that we worked with the Vista. And the Brown Berets came down, and I've heard a lot of stories that they were marching down the street with rifles. They didn't have arms, they had wooden rifles. They stayed at the Chicano Youth Center, and I lived in Brewer Hill, and right across from Brewer Hill is a park named Ibarra Park. Okay, my dad and my cousins and people in the hill, they started that park. Anyway, one of the things they wanted to do was to honor the Mexican unknown soldier. So they put up that little headstone. They were modeling after Cesar Chavez, Corky Gonzalez, and they were trying to come in and get the young people to be more involved with the Chicano movement at that time. And I knew a lot of these young men personally because I was very active with the Chicano Youth Center. And, you know, you hear all these crazy stories about they did this and all that. They were just a group of people, of young men. And the only harm they did in Silver City, maybe some babies were born after they left. But that was, I think it was kind of an awakening of how we were to embrace our Hispanic and be able to say, I'm proud to be a Chicana. And I think they brought that in. And poor guys, they wanted to get back to California, so we had to raise money to get them money to go back.
That's a story. I also want to mention when we're talking about, there's a clip from that visit of the Brown Berets at the Silver City Museum, a newspaper clipping on display if anyone is interested in stopping by. Looks like we have another question from whom? Oh, okay. Dolores Huerta also came through here, a well-renowned activist. Do we know her? Dolores Huerta?
She was Cesar Chavez's wife.
Oh, thank you. I'm coming. Oh, sister. Huh, Cesar Chavez's sister. No, I don't know. Okay.
Okay, Dolores Huerta was his counterpart. She helped begin the United Farm Workers. She was right next to him in every single protest. She was not his wife. She was not his lover. She was not his sister. She had her own family. Okay. Dolores Huerta is still living. She's from Dixon, New Mexico, and she comes to Silver City actually pretty regularly. She spends a lot of time in New Mexico. And yeah, find out more about her because no, she wasn't just his sidekick. She really was just as part of that movement, just like the women were in Empire's Inc. Same concept.
Orale.
To the women in the Empire State movement.
I stand corrected and I apologize. I will say that she was absolutely involved in all of the major UFW's activities, and she certainly is a very important character in farm worker history in the United States.
Coming. Be right back.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I really love that you centered the voices of the community and the folks you're working with. It doesn't happen often in historical research, I think. So it's really cool to see that. I've got so many questions for you, but I'm going to limit it to two, Javier. The first is, I know is a bit more complicated, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about how the Mexican-American War shaped sort of, I mean, even before the founding of Silver City, how it affected this area and how you might see the legacy of that in the work that you're doing, the historical project of Chihuahua Hill. So is it that people were dispossessed of their land and then were kind of forced into a very particular part of town? Or I'd love to hear more about that. And then very quickly, sorry, this one is a bit more personal. I could hear that you are finding your own family in the archive. I work with colonial archives and it's really intense, emotionally hard stuff to work with. So I'm really wondering, you don't have to answer if you don't want to, but how do you feel? Because you can sort of trace your own family in these archives while you're also sitting with some really intense materials about economic segregation. So thank you for your talk.
Yeah.
Oh, can I real quick?
Yeah.
Because there was another question from someone online that wanted to know how Chihuahua Hill got its name. And that does sort of fall into the question of territorial, the Mexican-American War. So thought that maybe you might stick that in there. Two birds.
Let me mix all these questions in my head. So the Mexican-American War, I think that really the biggest change that occurred, there's a ton of changes, but I think the attitudes that came to this region were among the biggest thing. Particularly like a different racialized view of the citizenship. Almost immediately, browner people became, second-class citizens across the board. Native Americans became second-class citizens across the board. And the people who were coming in, they were the ones who had money to start developing some of the civilizations that came up around here, like Silver City. So I would say like ideologies that came after the Mexican-American War, that was one of the biggest things. Just views on the other that came out of that. I have a whole lot of research and writing and stuff that I got about that I'd be happy to share with you. Yeah. And the other question, the personal one. I think I always said I was the perfect person for this job because of my love of history really grew from hearing all of these stories from, my grandma and my grandpa and my great grandparents. I feel like I know my great grandparents, even though I never met them, just from all the stories that I've heard. And it's cool, getting to put, I always say that history put my life into context. It gave my life a context that I didn't have before. So I can see the way things happened in my family from all the stuff that I'm finding out. Sometimes it's pretty sad finding this stuff out. A lot of times it's kind of cool, yeah, I think I feel like I'm really connected to this work and my heart's really in it. So it's been good for me. Sometimes a little sad, but good.
Thank you, Javi. Mr. Tom Hester has a question, and he has done a little bit of research and work with the 1880 census that is really phenomenal and part of some of our previous programs that are available online. But here.
He's my inspiration.
I do appreciate the voices that we heard, just terrific. And also appreciate the statistics that you shared with us. I especially like the occupational development of various ethnic and racial groups. It's really outstanding stuff. Sometimes it's difficult to account for people who are not there. And mentioning Cesar Chavez, sal si puedes. If you can't manage where you are, you leave. And I think there have been people who have grown up in Silver City and have left. I know of several who went to Southern California after serving in the armed forces and then returned to Silver City in retirement. And I was wondering if it's possible to account for outmarriage, those women who marry Anglos, for example, from the Mexican-American community, and those folks who grew up here and saw that they didn't have opportunity and decided that they needed to leave. Hard to account for them, but that's one of the methods of social mobility that's available to lots of folks.
Thank you, Tom.
Yeah, and I'm sure given enough research time, I could account for those people, but it's all it is time, which I'm willing to do eventually. This is just the beginning for a lot of the research that I've been doing. And I have this really cool census spreadsheet that I'm making that you might be interested in, Tom, that I want to share with you. So.
Well, I did genealogy on the Madrid family, my husband's family. And in Southern California, in Pico Rivera, Santana, there are so many Madrids from this family that it's not even funny. When one of the great grandmothers died, the church, we went to her services. The church she had 8 children. She had 68 grandchildren, and I believe it was 190 great grandchildren. It was so big, it wasn't even funny I mean, the Madrids that were from that area. In 2010, I had a memorial for my husband and sent out 5,000 invitations. The flame was so packed that we had over 500 people that were all Madrids that had come in and the ones here. So they left in the 50s. And I'm telling you, Southern California, like Tom was saying, they intermarried, big families. And like I say, if you're ever in Pico Rivera or Santana, you'll run across a Madrid.
Thank you, Patsy. I liked what Tom was saying about mobility. And one thing that touches on is something that I'm really interested in following up on that Javi pointed out. And that is the generational impact of this sort of thing. We like to think that everything is over and better now, or some people do. And it really has a longer term impact on a lot of people. So let's get to that eventually, but we have another question or two or three.
Thank you. My name is Noelle Rodriguez, and I recently returned after being away for 33 years. My father's family was from Santa Rita and raised in Hurley. And I want to thank you so much for putting this together. You know, it's brought up a lot of emotion. And so when you talk about how it affects generations, I'm here to tell you that it affects generations. My father left at 17 after the war, and he ended up in Southern California and Arizona, and then we came back to Baird when I was in middle school. And so I was raised in Baird, didn't see opportunity for me to stay here, so I left. I'm glad to be back. Now I come back with my father's writing. He went back to school, got his degree in Mexican American Studies and spent 20 years writing. He passed, unfortunately, this past January. However, I have his writing that I am going through and just trying to put some stuff together, but it's very emotional and it hits a lot of these topics. And I just thank you so much. This is a difficult discussion. Thank you for bringing it up.
You're welcome. And I'd love to talk to you at some point if you're willing.
We would love to talk to you at some point. So before you leave today, if you could give your information to either of me, anyone at home that wants to contact either of us, I'm cutting out. My email is education@silvercitymuseum.org and Javi is curator@silvercitymuseum.org. Who else we got? Okay.
Thanks, Javi. I'm Avery Jepson Brown.
What's up, dude?
Yeah, long time no see. I'm definitely interested in this history. I taught history at Aldo Leopold Charter School up until recently, and I was trying to do actually a project with students on this exact topic. And so, you know, this is a great resource for me. If I end up going back to that, that'll be awesome, and I'll try to link up with you about that. And I was wondering, like, if you have data that is somewhat correlated with the data that you have that's historical data that's current. So if you have census data that either shows a connection or shows a really big disconnect between those trends that are historical and now, and maybe specifically like the housing thing, like the neighborhood thing, if we had, because that was something that the brief research that my students did was relatively inconclusive. They couldn't find large wealth disparity between neighborhoods within Silver City, but you know, like I said, that was pretty brief research. So thank you.
Yeah, that is something that I've been working on, and I was hoping that I would get enough done to add it to this presentation, but it's a lot of work. So it's definitely something that I'm working on, and nothing that I have completely right now that I can present, but I'll keep in touch and I'll let you know.
George, will you be interested in expanding on that any? Would you be interested in expanding on that any? Do you have any?
On the historical, the impact of history on the present moment.
No, more, well, yes, and the present moment, and just in economic disparity in real estate.
Well,
Or then,
there have been all kinds of studies. It's very easy to find. The consequences of economic and racial segregation for the overall welfare of a community is just devastating. It destroys the quality of life for everyone in the community. It doesn't take a lot of insight to figure this out. If there is a great deal of difference in residential areas, the consequences on life expectancy for the entire community goes down because there's diminished availability of health services. There's an increase in the level of homicide, all those kinds of things. The people who wish to inflict this kind of segregation on people, I have absolutely no idea what their motives are, but it's impossible for me to think that there's nothing short of a great deal of venality behind it. There's a desire to maximize wealth concentration in a very small number of people without regard to the overall welfare of the community. I just have to say, I was really moved by the voices of the people. At the very beginning, Javi, there was the remark, we didn't know we were poor, but we would always help out. After 50 years of working with communities, I can tell you one thing. The level of compassion and the ability to help people exists in poorer communities. And for people who haven't been able to experience that kind of compassion and that kind of unity, you have really missed something. It is one of the greatest gifts that you can have. And, I am so happy to be a part of this community now because that is one factor of life in this town, which continues on.
One of the things that I remember as a little girl is that growing up in Brewer Hill, just about everybody owned their home, whether it was a little 1-bedroom or, we would add rooms according to how many kids were born, but they were owned by the people. Same way in Chihuahua Hill, they were owned by the people. There weren't that many rentals. And I think when my father came back from World War II, the family had already built a little house next door to my grandparents. And it was like the community would help. The neighborhood would help build. And I remember my grandmother say, we may not have the prettiest house in Silver City, pero es mía, it's mine. And I think that was the pride, whatever they had, that piece of land, they were proud and they had worked hard for it. And she would say, you see those big houses? They're going to be paying for them all their lives. This one's mía. And she was really proud of that. So I think when we look and we said we're poor, we were poor, but we were happy and we had a roof over our heads. That was ours.
all right, thank you. And Hugh Epping?
I'm curious about the political situation from 50 years ago. Currently, or back 50 years ago, it seemed like everybody in governmental positions was Anglo, and it has changed. And what has brought about that change? were there issues with voting eligibility or just an enthusiasm to become a little more politically involved and powerful?
Yes.
Well, you know, when I started being a lawyer, it's 45 years ago. Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act was in effect. There were changes that were made possible to increase political power on the part of minorities. I was privileged to participate in maybe about at least 15 or so class actions against municipalities in Florida to make sure that they went from they implemented systems of single member voting. It was also possible at that time to use the laws that existed at that time to equalize municipal services of, you know, or in a municipality. None of that stuff exists anymore. So, you know, it takes a combination of things, I think, to make it possible. I have to say, I just voted in the Democratic primary, and it was a really great sensation to know that I was voting for an entirely Hispanic group of elected officials. You know, it takes the community to do that, and it also takes the law. We're moving backwards on law, and it's up to the community to try and move things forward.
You know, going back, I think it was a lack of confidence. You have to realize that, you know, we were second class. We didn't have that education that the white people had. And we didn't have the confidence. And slowly, like Benny Altamirano comes up, you know, and Dave Cerna, who was one of our DAs, and, you know, they went, Benny was from us. He was our, you know, he had a store. He worked hard all his life, and he went into politics. And it was people like him and like Dave Cerna and our police chief, Tommy Ryan, and Ernie Gomez here working. They gave us the confidence that as Hispanics, we could do it. And it was we didn't know that we could do it. And it took these people to open those doors, and then we came pretty powerful.
Confidence in knowing is a huge.
It really is. I always tell people that I feel like, you know, studying all this stuff, I can kind of see it, that I feel like I was conditioned to think a certain way about myself. And because of that, there was a lot of apathy in a lot of things that I did. And I didn't want to participate in anything, because why should I? So it's not going to change. This is the way it's always been. And I've always felt that, you know, having representations that you can actually see, you know, them doing good for themselves or the community. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And, you know, also we forget women were even treated worse. I mean, hey, we had a hard time at being female. We were supposed to be submissive, which I hate that word. And, you know, stay home and cook and take care of the kids. And that was what a good Hispanic woman did. You know, they go to church, and that was their only time away to be able to gossip, and they have something to eat while they clean the church. But other than that, it was hard for Mexican women. And if you didn't follow that, then there was something wrong with you. Yeah. So, you know, when you talk about everything, women had it pretty rough too.
Yeah.
I have a couple questions. So one, I work in ecological restoration. I think about ecology and food sovereignty a lot. And also being from an indigenous nation where our relations with the plants and animals around us were a really important part of our cosmology and our spiritual understanding of the universe. Through these different lenses, when I'm looking at these photos of really harsh desert, and it looked like it was even harsher then than it is now, and I'm wondering where the food was coming from. And I'm wondering what the gardens and small farms in Chihuahua Hill area looked like back then versus what they looked like in other communities. And then wondering about the specific plants that were being grown and where, and about the ancestral cultural roots of like how those plants arrived and what role food sovereignty and what role the ecology played in the food sovereignty, and then what role the food sovereignty played in this economic segregation during the time. And so that's kind of one question. I just would love to know a little bit about what the relations with plants and animals and those ecosystems were, how they related to the economic segregation. Other question is related to how the psychological effects of poverty and economic segregation resonate after institutional structures, segregation structures open up a little bit. You still have the residual psychological effects, for example, thinking that I don't have access, which can be passed down generation to generation subconsciously without ever being spoken. This understanding that I don't have access can continue even after maybe structurally there is more access. So I wonder, how does, like, what do we do about that? How does that aspect heal? What can we do communally? What can we do as individuals? Yeah.
That's a lot in there. Okay, so let's start off with, I think what you're getting on is natural sources. Is that where we're going? Okay, where did the food come from, and how did food insecurity play into currently in generation?
Yeah, I'll admit I'm probably not the best person to ask for this. And I was looking over there. I wonder if you know anything about this question.
Anybody? Anybody want to chime in?
The only thing I can think of is in Chihuahua Hill and Brewer Hill, they grew squash and tomatoes, but you know, a lot of flowers, fruit trees, a lot of apple trees, and the men always hunted. The men always hunted, and I think a lot of the meat, you know, rabbit, deer, you know, they were always hunting and fishing. So that was a big part of the food that was for the Hispanics, but it was through hunting. But they shared everything. So that was good.
I wish that Joe Sines was here. My understanding of, from talking to Joe, is beginning around the 1880s, mainly egregiously wealthy white people brought in cattle and had a fairly substantial impact on the grasslands around here. And the cattle industry was able to thrive and go on for, I don't know, 30, 40 years without totally ruining everything. Since then, it's become, that industry has become a really a bad investment for everybody. You know, that's the only thing I can add to that. Stephen Fox probably knows way more about this than I do.
Okay, Stephen, you've been called out. Now you better know more. All right, we're waiting for this now.
The problem with Here. Is that okay? Oh, okay. All right. Yes. There was a rich range of grama grass between here and Deming in the late 1800s. How's that? How's that? Oh, there it is. Okay. Yeah. But the cattle business finally got some regulation because they got barbed wire fencing after about 1900. It was used elsewhere in the West, but it didn't become common here until about after 1900. And at that point, the cattle did somewhat less damage because they were contained. Ranchers could control where they were grazing. The other big difference is that the National Forest was established here in 1899, and they regulated how those lands were used for grazing, lumbering, hunting, fishing, and that has made a huge difference. The reason we had all those floods in the late 1800s, early 1900s is because the cattle had wiped out the grass north of here, in the mountains north of here. There was nothing to hold the water, and so down it came and it flooded here. We had annual disasters here until probably the 1920s. It finally stopped as well, because again, there was some regulation of cattle behavior.
Thank you, Steve. Time to switch out mics. Who else?
What was the
wait,
second
there was
half of that
another part.
question?
Yeah, about the psychological impact. You talked a little bit about confidence, but the psychological impact of throughout the generations, hearing that you're not able to do certain things or shouldn't, right? Is that approximate? Okay, yeah, that-
And how do we go forward healing that?
yes.
I know in my own experience, the two things were really important for me. It was number one was representation, which I thought was really lacking when I was a kid, and something that everybody who, all the voices that we heard today talked about was education. I think those two things are so important to understanding, where you come from and not only who you are, but what you can be. So I think immediately, like in our immediate area, focusing on those two things can help out a lot of people. But really, getting to heal a lot of those like generational issues. It's really dealing with the bigger problems of like institutionalized racism, stuff like that, which that's a really big question. And I'm not sure what's the best way to go about doing that. It's kind of above my pay grade. So for me in my immediate area, I just try to push education and representation as much as I can.
And also to let, our people know that it can be done. All you have to do is just try. And you're right, education. And I still think that a lack of confidence, and hopefully now with our education, since we get free tuition in universities, I think is wonderful. A lot of our Hispanic kids will be going to college, and, maybe we'll get over this bump that's always been there.
I can't hold back. Education is truly very important in this. And I just want to point out that we might not be able to have this conversation. We might not be able to have this kind of education if we elect people like the governor of Texas.
Okay. So let's try to stay out of politics and then mentioning names. We are a nonprofit. The museum is owned by the town. Anyway, but noted. Next.
A little earlier this month, I was talking with a woman who is here from Phoenix, hoping to move here. buy a place and move here. And she was working with a realtor whom she did not name. And she was given a little map of places to go and look at houses that were available. Well, she was on this side of town. And the realtor pointed up to Brewer Hill and said, "Don't even go there. It's going on."
Okay.
Absolutely.
Someone else. Sorry, he was a split second before you. Good reflexes, sir.
I just wanted to say that as far as Brewer Hill and Chihuahua Hill, I grew up in the 60s or 50s, and it was highly segregated. But I see it now, and there's a lot of white and Hispanic people living in there. And sometimes I wonder about Chihuahua Hill, whether it's like 75% white. But it's really nice to see that.
I was really struck by one part of the presentation where one of the workers was saying they don't want us educated. They want us to continue to be laborers. Because this is something I've thought about an awful lot, just as a writer, is that it seems in general, not even as a characteristic of capitalism, but as a characteristic just of civilization in general. A certain number of low-paid, unskilled workers seems like it's necessary for any economy to thrive. So I guess what I'm wondering is in the context here of Grant County, and you guys have touched on how important education is as far as mobility. But according to your research, or even just by your own perceptions, has that situation been completely resolved? You know, is there ample educational opportunities for everyone here in Grant County now, as opposed to back then?
So speaking from my own experience, I don't think so. I talk to a lot of people here in town, and everybody's kind of amazed to see someone like me in my position. And a lot of people, white or Chicano, talk about how important it is for more people like me to be in positions like this. And you don't see it a lot. There's a couple boards that I sit on where I'm the only Chicano, and I'm constantly the liaison to the Hispanic community. And a lot of people that I grew up with, and a lot of people that I know just from my life, I know, a lot of them are struggling still. So no, I don't think it's been resolved at all.
Thank you, Javi. I just want to remind people we are getting close to the end. So any more questions, keep them coming, but let's keep them brief. And if you are at home right now, please do write in your questions, your comments. Let us know. We want to get you in on this too. Okay, who else? Oh, come on. All right. So you get to go first because you're in front. Oh, okay.
So maybe just the presentation made me think a lot, Javi, about small barriers. Not, we've gotten to where we don't necessarily have legal institutional rules that make these things happen. And I think you're the part of your talk about the bañadero, the swimming hole. I think we should show that to the Forest Service folks, because they're coming up with rules for their campgrounds and recreation areas that probably will put in place small fees, probably will put in place a reservation system, which don't seem like barriers. They seem like kind of good things for middle class or upper class folks. For poor folks, it may not be such a good thing.
That is a great comment, Alan. Anyone else out there on the panel or anywhere have anywhere to contribute to that? Because I know that growing up, I wasn't the best off in some circumstances, but all of these little fees that they add up to the quality of living for a family, I think, as we've seen.
Yeah.
We no longer do. We don't, there is no charge for entry at the museum or at any of our programs. If you can, we do request a donation just to keep us going, but just so you know, don't spread disinformation.
Yeah, there seems to be some things where a lot of little ways where it kind of seems like people are punished for being poor. No good.
You know, one of the things I just thought of, now you see a lot more people concerned about saving for their children's education. My God, growing up, there was no savings of any kind. People lived paycheck to paycheck and hope they could make it through. And I think that was one of the things when, you know, if you want to go to even like Art Sanchez said, going to the Catholic schools, because they had St. Mary's that had up to elementary and St. Vincent's, you know, that was money people couldn't afford. I went to 6th Street School, public. But I mean, thinking of somebody going to college in the 50s and 60s, where was the money going to come from? I mean, you know, people struggle to make it from one paycheck to the next. And a lot of these minors would actually leave most of their check with a company store in Hurley and Santa Rita. So it was tough.
It's a little bit off the line, but the whole concept of the company store and the mines here is something that I'd heard about on the East Coast where I grew up and some of my family stuff. And then to hear it again here is unbelievable that people used to be able to get away with this in businesses. Do you, maybe George, someone want to explain the concept of the company store where some workers weren't even paid in money, but were paid in chits or credit?
Yeah, this is a form of economic domination where the objective on the part of the employer is to cause the employee to get into debt and to limit the available places where one can go shop and acquire things. There are laws in the United States against peonage. It is a condition which still exists in a lot of places. You know, there have not been very many prosecutions for that over time, and there are getting to be a lot fewer. This is one of the areas, especially when you're considering people who do farm work. This is a significant issue. It continues to be, and all I can say is that it is a way to actually destroy the human spirit.
Yes.
You know, a person's work has just a tremendous amount of importance to a person's sense of self-worth. And, you know, this is a soul-crunching, ruinous kind of way of proceeding.
Thank you. Anyone else? There was a period of time here, am I correct, Javi, where the mines in, was it Santa Rita or Chino, where workers were paid only in credit and chits that could only be redeemed at the company store. And since that was one of the largest employers in this county, and as we saw, so many of the mining and laborer jobs were the Hispanic population, that sort of shows a direct or indirect correlation between that sort of almost economic oppression and outright race. Yeah, sorry. Okay, anyone else? All right, I think that we are about at that time. I want to thank everybody for coming. I want to thank our panelists, George Carr, Patsy Madrid, and of course, Javier Marrufo. I also want to thank everyone who has joined from home and the people that hold the camera, Patrick Jones. And from Will, we had Mary Stecker earlier. Alan is in the back. Will is Western Institute for Lifelong Learning, and they are wonderful. Ask the man in the green shirt. He'll tell you. Aha, go after him. And our volunteers out front and EJ and everybody else, thank you very much. Head on over to the yard sale at the Silver City Museum and see that really weird but really cute Italian lemonade machine thing. Also, if you can, please donate to the Silver City Museum. Help us keep going. Fill out the survey. Help me keep going. And shop at the store. Visit the
Nice.
website.
Thank you, everyone.
Join the society. Thank you, guys.